Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the third Prophetic Imagination gathering of the Alliance of Baptists. As people are coming into the room, I invite you to put your name in the chat and your church and your location as a way of greeting one another. Welcome, welcome as we gather for the third Prophetic Imagination gathering of the Alliance of Baptists. As we go through this evening's program, I invite you to remember to breathe, to blink, to keep your eyes lubricated by blinking, and to put your reactions and your gratitude to those who are sharing in the chat. Let's let those who are telling their stories tonight know how much we appreciate them. Remember to keep your microphones on mute and to put your questions in the chat as well. The Prophetic Imagination gatherings of the Alliance of Baptists are an offering of the Churches That Thrive for Racial Justice project. It's a 5-year project funded by the Lilly Endowment in collaboration with 26 congregational partners, many of whom are represented by you in tonight's gathered group, along with the sociologists of race and religion that are also, some of them are already in the room, Gerardo Marti, Kevin Dougherty, and Mark Mulder. So thank you everyone for coming. These gatherings are designed to inspire and motivate and equip church leaders for the work that is required to dismantle oppressive structures and racist structures that are an obstacle to congregations thriving. Tonight's Prophetic Imagination gatherings focus is knowing your history, bringing justice. So acknowledging, knowing, and understanding your church's history in your context is among the first steps necessary to growing a racially just ministry. Meeting that history midstream, creativity, selfless courage, and love is how racially just ministries are cultivated. So tonight we will hear interviews conducted by co-director Elijah Zayu of representatives from 2 churches that are in the Thrive cohort. We are thrilled to hear from leaders of Ravensworth Baptist Church in Annandale, Virginia, as they share what they have learned exploring their history and their context. And we are excited to introduce to Alliance congregations leaders of First Baptist Church of Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, a progressive Baptist congregation that has taken seriously the recommendations of the Truth and Justice Reconciliation Commission on addressing the harm that has been done to Indigenous peoples in their region. So to open our meeting tonight with prayer and a smudge is Ann Magnuson, an Indigenous elder who is a member at First Baptist Edmonton. So I invite all of us to breathe deeply, to center yourselves comfortably in your chair as we are led in our opening prayer by Ann. Thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you, Ann, for opening our meeting with prayer. Let's get you pinned first before you start so that everybody can see you and hear you. Okay, would you open us, please?
Yes, my name is Ann, and I'm from the Tsimshian First Nation, which is in northern BC. My language is called Smaliach, and my reserve is called Lachwa Alams, which means place of wild roses. I'm on Treaty 6 land, and it's mostly Cree here. There are some other First Nations as well represented on Treaty 6 land. I've lived here on Treaty 6 land for 55 years now, so I feel like I'm really a part of it, and this is where I came back to my culture. I'm a residential school survivor and a 60 scoop survivor, and I've come to do a smudge. And smudging is our way of praying to our Creator, and we, as Indigenous people, really believe in the healing power of the Creator. So what I have here, I have a braid of sweetgrass. It's one of the things we use. And I'm using sage, which I've rolled into a ball. It's not always rolled into a ball. Sometimes it comes in kind of a longer stick thing. And I have my eagle feather, and it's a real eagle feather with the 4 colors of the nations attached to the eagle feather. The red, what I've got on mine is the red, the blue, the yellow, and the white. And different First Nations might use different colors. My First Nation would put black in there, not the blue color. And the Cree used the green color. So I'm going to burn the smudge now and say a prayer. We use everything natural. We remove our jewelry so we come to Creator in a simple and natural way. But I use wooden matches. And I will ask people here to stand in a circle. We bring smoke over our heads and over our eyes. As we're asking Creator to help us have the thoughts He wants us to have, help our eyes to see what He wants us to see, and over our ears, help us to hear and listen to what He wants us to hear and listen to, and over our mouths, and ask Creator to give us the words He wants us to speak, and over our hearts, and ask Creator to give us a good, kind heart. Hi. But I'll ask God to hold it while I smudge. Creator, help my hands to do the work You want my hands to do. Help my thoughts to be as You want my thoughts to be. And my eyes to see what it is You want me to see. And my ears to hear and listen to what You want me to hear and listen to. And Creator, I ask that the words that come from my mouth will be the words You want me to speak. Creator, help me to have a good, kind heart. Thank You for all things, Creator. Aye. When we smudge, we ask Creator for these things, and we smudge each time. And sometimes in circles when I've smudged, there have been people who haven't been comfortable with smudging, and that's okay. And we simply ask them to cross their arms. And when I see crossed arms, then I'll pass them by and go to the next person. So we never force people to smudge. Everybody has their own way of praying. So that's our smudge. And hi, everybody. which means thank you in Cree.
Thank you so much, Anne, for your leadership and for your invitation for us to join you in a sacred part of your tradition and to allow us to enter this space within your tradition. It's good to see all of you here today, and it's good to be with all of you as well. My name is Elijah Zayu, and it is my honor to be here with you as a representative of the Alliance of Baptists and as a representative of the work that we are doing for Thrive as well. And so, one second. And as a representative for Thrive as well. Can everyone see me okay? Thumbs up. All right, great. Awesome. Well, as has already been stated, okay, it looks like we're seeing, okay. All right, now we're good. All right. Well, as has already been stated, our purpose tonight is to dive a little bit more deeply into our history and into the significance of studying history and to learn about how our fellow communities, how our fellow friends across the continent are doing that work. And so it is my honor and privilege to get to facilitate a conversation between leaders and members of First Baptist Church of Edmonton in Canada and Ravensworth Baptist Church in Virginia. And what we hope is that the work that these two churches are doing will allow us to further understand, to further see our own path for doing the history in our own communities, in our own locations, in our own personal spaces. For those of you that do not know me, in addition to serving as the co-director of the Alliance of Baptists, I'm also a trained historian of Africa and the African diaspora. And as one of my professors used to say, that whenever people are talking about history, I'm happy. And I'm excited to be with y'all tonight because we are going to get to talk about history. And not just the history that lives in the pages of the books, but the history that comes alive in our circles, in our world, in our community, in our neighborhoods, in our states, and our respective countries. For those of you who have been paying attention over the last few years, history, teaching and talking about the history of North America, of the particular nation states that make up North America today, the United States, Canada, Mexico, those places has become contested in our political discourse. So much so that in several dozen states within the United States, there has been legislation put forth and passed, if not close to passing, which bans the teaching of a particular type of history, particularly a history that's critical of the settlers who made their way from Europe to the Americas. That's the context that we live in. And despite that being the context that we live in, it is not something that we have to accept. For we know that the teaching of history, telling the truth about our past, about our present, and about our future is a very sacred part of our work as people of faith, as Christians, as people interested in a more just world. So with the backdrop all around up of a contestation of history, we also have the invitation, the opportunity to dig a little bit more deeply, to understand our history for ourselves, and to see the possibility that history allows for us. Brian Stevenson likes to say that you cannot understand things from a distance, but you got to get close. Our conversation tonight will be an opportunity to get close to what the history of these communities, these people, these churches mean for their work as they seek to be more faithful followers of God and more faithful and better neighbors to one another. So without hearing too much more from me, let us begin the conversation. I will invite Jeremy and Ann back with us to join me here on our virtual stage and our virtual platform so that we can have this conversation, right? To learn more about your church, about First Baptist Edmonton, and the good work that you all are doing. So I'll give it a second to see. Are they spotlighted for everyone? Can I get a thumbs up? Okay, great. All right. Awesome. Well, Jeremy and Ann, let's just get straight into this conversation. I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C., inside the United States of America, and you all are our neighbors, right across what is, to me, our northern border. We are your neighbors to the south, right? And I think the location of where we sit and how we conceptualize sort of where we are can inform in many ways the work that we're doing. So tell us a little bit about your context, about First Baptist Edmonton, and about the work examining your history that you all have felt called to do at First Baptist Edmonton.
Yeah, like I said, my name is Jeremy, and we are sitting about 800 meters, which I think is about half a mile away from the site of what would have been a Hudson's Bay Company trading fort from about 1795 to 1914. And in that time, those European settlers who were pursuing the fur trade used what was traditional lands of the First Peoples and a famous and ancient site for trade called Beaver Hills. And then the local people started calling it Beaver Hills House because of that big building that the settlers put there. In the local language, that would have been Amasquitchie-Waskaigan, which would have meant Beaver Hills House, which is already a strange word that it's taking a settler idea and mixing it with the language of an indigenous population. So then about 100 years went by after that fort was demolished. And I would say the average Canadian thought maybe Canada hadn't done such a terrific job with its First Peoples. Maybe we had some hard lessons to learn. But some of those hard lessons took the form of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2007. And that's where a lot of us were confronted with some of the real harm that had been done by our colonial ancestors. And with that commission, there were 94 calls to action, 2 of which called denominations and churches to do this work to educate themselves and do better. I'll probably leave it there if you have more questions or if Ann wants to add to that.
Yeah, Ann, would you like to add to that, to telling us a little bit about the context that you all live in and how you got started doing this work, especially this work, examining your history and doing truth and reconciliation?
Well, for me, it has to go back to residential schools. And residential schools were a terrible, terrible thing that they did. I was 5 years old when I was put in residential school, as was my mother. I'm second generation of residential schools. Now, residential schools started in the 1800s, and the last one closed in 1996. That is a long, long time, but it took even longer for anybody to learn about residential schools and what they were. People lived in communities where there were residential schools, but knew nothing about residential schools. And today I'm finding that a lot of people don't know about residential schools or don't understand what they were about. So I'm finding there's a great deal of teaching to do. And with my experience of having been in residential school, I'm able to go to schools and to different agencies and stuff to do some teachings. I used to be a social worker, so I have connection with quite a few nonprofit agencies and with schools too, junior high schools and elementary schools. And it's spreading the knowledge, teaching. And it's a long way to go yet, but we're making small steps. That Creator, I believe, is leading us just exactly the way we need to be led. Just taking exactly the steps He wants us to take. If we try to do it our way, we mess it up. So I I really believe that Creator guides us in the way we should go and opens the doors that we need to go through and closes the ones he doesn't want us to go through.
Thank you, Anne. And you mentioned your experience in the residential schools, which sounds like a very difficult and hard part of just not only you and your family's story, but also the broader story of your community. Can you for especially for those of us in the United States, can you give us a little bit more insight into why those schools existed, and I guess what were some memories, if you feel comfortable sharing, of your experiences there?
Well, the reason for the schools was they wanted to change the Native people. We call ourselves Indigenous people here. We've had so many names, I sometimes don't know what to call myself. But the Indigenous is the last name that was chosen for us. So they wanted to change our people, take the savage out of the Indian, is what it says in the history books. And they took away our culture, and they took away our language, and people could be put in jail if they were caught practicing their culture. And a lot of people don't know that, but that's what happened. And in residential school, we were never allowed to speak our language. We were never allowed to practice our culture. And we just went by the way we worshiped was the way the church worshiped. And for me, the school I went to was the United Church. There's a lot of Catholic churches around the schools, and Presbyterian, Anglican, Methodist, and some Baptist. So the teaching was taught. And when my kids were little in the 1970s, I wasn't even aware that schools were still operating either. And I was quite taken aback when I learned that, because I didn't even think about that, because I was so little when I went to residential school. I didn't understand why I was there or what residential schools were for until I was older. And my mother was there too, and she didn't know. And as a result, my sister's kids ended up in foster care. A lot of people ended up in foster care. I ended up, and my brothers ended up in foster care because my mother wasn't able to take care of us. She never learned what it was like to be a mother. She didn't have a role model for a mother. And so she just didn't know how. And I didn't learn that till I was an adult. And I was grateful when I did learn that, because I was able to understand and forgive her and not be angry anymore. And there are a lot of our people still who have residential school backgrounds in their families who are still on a healing path. It's been a long, long time, and we still got a long ways to go, but we're making forward steps now, which I am grateful for. And I see healing happening in our communities. I see positive things happening in our communities. And I'm always praying for my community.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you sharing, and your remarks just takes me back to the idea, right, that I think for so many of us who currently live in North America, and whether we are come from ancestors who are European, or like me, my ancestors are African, right? But so many of us, who currently occupy the land that is North America, are people who migrated here. Some of us migrated voluntarily, and of course, in the story of African descendant people, so many of us were forced to migrate here through the transatlantic slave trade and through other constructions of violence, right? And what I'm mindful of as I listen to you talk, the history, whether it's Columbus's arrival, or the arrival of the Dutch, or the arrival of the English, or the arrival of the Spanish, or the arrival of the French, or whichever, isn't just a story that's relegated to the past, right? That's removed from us by 500 or 600 or so years, but it's a story, as you said, that has continued into 1996, which is very much so much of the lifespan of everyone here on this call, at least from from what I can see. And so my question for you, and Jeremy, might could take a stab at this too, is what do you think it means for us to be so close to such a violent history, to this history as I hear you talk about it, and that the residential schools were really institutional cultural genocide, right? If that language isn't too strong, but that's a part of what I'm hearing you describe, right? That they wanted you all to be in those schools to remove you from your culture and to remove you from really your identity, your source. And so what does it mean, do you think, for us to acknowledge, to recognize our proximity to this violent history that is not really 500 years ago, but it's more like the present. It's more like in our lifetime.
It's my turn. I'll say something. Only very recently, people started using ground penetrating radar to identify the unmarked graves of many of the children who had suffered immensely in these schools. And it became a grim sort of news item. Every morning we would find out that they had identified yet more bodies in different towns across Canada. And I think part of the work of the descendants of settlers is to refuse to live in denial, to really sit with what it means to live in a place that has the bones of children under the ground that we walk on. And not to just pass that off as something that happened in the past, recognize that that is something that happened in fairly recent history and still continues to affect the lives of people that we know. And I'll add to that entire episode and the last year prompted a visit from the Pope this last summer, who came to Edmonton and visited different Indigenous nations in the area as a sort of apology tour that was met by some people with open arms and still with a lot of frustration by other people still, who feel like the church has a lot more work to do still.
Yeah. And here we are, right? Connected to one another through churches, through religious institutions. And, for me as a Baptist, right, I can think, all right, well, the Baptists don't have as much of a history of this in Canada. Next week, the broader Alliance organization will be going to Montgomery, Alabama, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the Baptist connection to enslavement in other parts of North America and the Caribbean. But, we can maybe as Baptists say, well, we're not as close to the issue in Canada, right? So we are somewhat absolved. But I guess my question, for you, either Anne or Jeremy, right? What is it, within the broader Christian tradition, right? Especially knowing that all of us Christians, right, are tied to a similar historical source, right? Whether we go back to Jesus, whether, we go back to when the Catholic Church was the only Christian institution. Yesterday was October 31st, right? The Reformation, right? And Protestantism doesn't exist without Martin Luther, and that rebellion that started there. So talk to us a little bit about the role that Christian institutions, broadly defined, played in this overall settler colonial project. And perhaps as you all see it, what responsibility do we as inheritors, as progenitors of that tradition have now? And maybe to add another question to that too, you can choose any of this. Why still be a part of the Christian tradition, knowing that story, knowing that past, knowing that history?
I think the best way for me to talk about that is to talk about how I came to be a Christian as an Indigenous person, because I'm 78 years old, and I was 16 when I first became a Christian. and started going to a Baptist church. And so I've been a Baptist for a long, long time, but I didn't know about my culture until I was about 46, 47 years old. And it hasn't been an easy journey. It's been a very difficult journey. The Baptist churches were not open to people, Indigenous people, going to their churches when I started going. Not just the Baptist, but any church. And I was going to United Church at the time because the school that I went to was run by the United Church. I thought that was where I should be going. But a story that I sometimes share is that I went to a Baptist church one day, and I was in the Sunday school class. I mean, I was just a teenager at the time. And one of the kids, it was actually the pastor's daughter, who started criticizing the United Church and saying all sorts of really negative things about the United Church. And I was very angry and upset about that. And I thought in my head, I never ever said it out loud. I've always been a person who hasn't done a lot of speaking until lately. And I thought in my head, I will never enter a Baptist church again. So it almost turned me away, but it seemed like it wasn't Creator's plan for me. He had the plan for me to go to the Baptist church. So I ended up coming back to the Baptist church. And here I stayed and kept going to the Baptist church for the rest of my life. And still, they weren't open to Indigenous people. I did get some negative stuff about Native people at the Baptist church I was attending, which hurt me very deeply because something inside me told me that what they were saying was wrong. Although I didn't have a lot of the history at that point of my own Indigenous people. So I learned gradually as I went along, and as I went into North American Baptist College and into another college here in Edmonton, I started learning more and more and more, and finally got to the point where I could love myself and learn to love myself and not think of myself as a dirty, stupid, lazy Indian as I'd been taught. And I got some of that negative stuff even from the church. But not First Baptist Church. First Baptist Church was different. I didn't come to First until 1995. And it wasn't long after that. Well, first we went to East Africa, and that was an eye-opener for me. A small group of us went as a short-term mission. And then after that, I started being asked about Indigenous stuff and I began to being asked to do some teachings about our Indigenous culture. And to me, this is incredible. You know, it's taken a long, long time. As I told you, I was 16 when I started going to the Baptist church. I'm now 78. And now we're starting to really move forward, but it's been a long journey. I've just had to be patient and wait for Creator to open those doors. So I'm grateful. I'm really grateful for First Baptist Church and how open they are to learn about our Indigenous culture. We have had the circles here in Smudging, and we called our circle Sit and Listen, because sitting and listening is so important. We tend to do, as human beings, a lot of talking and not enough listening. And in our culture, we do try to do a lot of listening and learning to understand what's happening out there and who people are and where they come from. And so that's so important.
Oh. And thank you for opening up even more and sharing these aspects of your story that really, help us to see how you have lived through so many things that I think many of us have to read about or maybe reflect on, but may not be as close as you, right? And I think that's a part of why it's so important to hear from you, right? Is because you allow us the type of access to the proximity to the very real cost of our theological decisions, the way that we choose to engage with people from other cultures, other traditions. And, what I hear from you is also, why it's important to be courageous, right? And why it's important to learn about different traditions. I love that it was a trip to East Africa that began to inspire the congregation a bit more to turn to you to learn about the tradition at home. Jeremy, help us understand what exactly is it that led First Baptist Edmonton to do this truth and reconciliation work? As I understand it, right, as a part of the truth and reconciliation work that happened, one of the formal recommendations was that churches look at their history. But we know that recommendations are ignored all the time, right? So what was it about First Baptist Edmonton, whether the theology, whether the leadership, whether the community, that said, no, we got to take this seriously. We have to look within. We have to pay attention to this.
I think it's probably been a part of the DNA of this church for quite a while. But I would say in the last 7 or 8 years, there's been a lot more work to name and live into the identity of the church. And so there was a certain committee, and we spent a whole bunch of time working on our identity statement, which named racism, sexism, homophobia, colonialism, classism, and missing an ism. What am I missing? There's only 5? Oh, there, I named all, I wasn't missing one. Not that those are the only issues in the world, but those were the ones that we wanted to really focus on and felt like something we could, each one of those things are something we could do something about. And as it happened, it's pretty tricky business to try and do this work without some Indigenous friends. The white settler folks who just walk around and want to do the work of reconciliation need the grace and the generosity of Indigenous folks who share healing circles with them, who invite them into this story, even though it's really difficult. And so the gift to First Baptist Church Edmonton was this woman named Ann Magnuson, who'd been a part of our church since 95. And so for us, anything we've ever done, every move we've made towards any sort of baby steps towards truth and reconciliation or answering those calls to action, we run them past Ann, and we wouldn't do anything that didn't receive her blessing and her guidance. And so we're just immensely grateful that she's in our midst, and she has such an open heart and a generous way of sharing her culture with us. And she has a terrific amount of patience for the slow settler people that gather around her.
Jeremy, say one more word. I think for a lot of those of us, in my context, in the United States context, right, who are listening, and we have a different set of issues, but very much so related to the same origins. As a descendant of settler people yourself, were you afraid of doing this work? Were you what was your own relationship to doing this work, and how has it transformed over time? How have you come to, find yourself, sitting next to Ann and really learning from her, sitting and listening and learning?
I don't know if I would describe myself as fearful or afraid to do the work. I've definitely been afraid that whatever we did was going to turn into a token gesture that didn't in the end have real legs to it in the long term. I've been definitely concerned and fearful that we were going to end up just sort of checking a few boxes and then moving on. Hopefully the work that we're doing has set some deep roots in this community. For example, for our young people, for just any of us who are on this learning journey. I can't say I've been afraid. I've been just immensely grateful all the way through, and really glad that, and again, I say this as someone who feels like we're still in the early stages of this work and don't know where it's going to go. The tendency of a church is to sort of coalesce into people that all kind of look the same. And this is the kind of work that pushes us and encourages us to find other voices that we weren't even listening to before. So,
well, Oh, well, let me ask you this, and then I want to give you a final question. But for someone listening who might be afraid, right? Who might think, I don't know, going back and looking at the settler past is going to open up a can of worms. It's going to make people more upset. It's going to cause more disharmony than harmony. Do you have anything to offer them? Do you have anything to say to them for maybe why they should consider doing this work, or what potentially is on the other side?
I think it will upset people. It has upset people. I've met people that want to live in denial still about our history and who want to downplay the suffering of Indigenous people. That's the part. We aren't a monolith in Canada. We have our own brands of racism, and we have our own kinds of extremists and people that want to deny the truth. So it's not, I don't think it gets to be easy work, but if we do believe that the truth will set us free, then let's pursue the truth, no matter what that looks like, even if it's really uncomfortable. That's the only way to move forward.
I like that. Let's pursue the truth if we really believe the truth will set us free. And my question to you, as someone whose life is invested in this work, whose life is very necessary for this work, what do you hope for, right? You've been on this journey for a long time now, and you have so much wisdom and insight into life. What do you hope that Truth and Reconciliation will do for us, for your community, for your people, for our broader world? What's the, if there is any hope, what's the hope?
Oh, I think there's hope. Definitely there's hope. There's a lot of healing work to be done yet on both sides, for our Indigenous and our non-Indigenous. A lot of healing work to be done. There's a lot of negative stuff happening out there in our community, but we're moving forward. And that's the thing we have to focus on. We're moving forward. Even if it's small steps, it's exactly the steps that Creator wants us to take. And I know that from my own experience. Even though it's taken me a while to get where I am today, I've gone exactly the journey that Creator wants me to take. And sometimes we are totally surprised by the journey He has us on, going to where we didn't ever think we'd go. I'd never thought ever in my whole life I'd be sitting here doing something like this, for instance. I'm still amazed as I sit here, and I'm grateful at the same time. So, yeah, we are moving forward, and it is making a difference in our church, slowly but surely, and hopefully other churches. I know there are some other churches who have Indigenous stuff going on in their church too. So it is happening, and I'm grateful.
And then one last question. I see someone just posted in the chat, and we'll have more time for questions in a bit, but I want to give you a chance just to answer this. Wim is wondering, you said that Native or First Nation people have been called different things. How do you want to be referred to as? How do you want to be understood?
How do I want to be understood or called?
How do you want to be called?
Oh, that is so confusing. Aboriginal was okay when I was there because it included the Métis, the Inuit, and the First Nation. Indian was not acceptable. It was used in a derogatory way, as well as Columbus thought that he was in India when he landed in America, in North America. And First Nations, we called ourselves First Nations, but First Nations is a whole different group. Again, our culture is very complicated.
Yeah.
And it was made complicated by colonialism. So what we call ourselves is very complicated too.
Yeah.
For all of us,
Yeah.
I'm still learning. I went to a annual general meeting with a couple of ladies, and we were talking about the Métis, and that's the people who are part Native, but my teaching was that they were descendants from the Louis Riel and the Red River and all that. But I learned something entirely different about the Métis with these two people who were Métis. And it got all the more confusing. So it just seems like, I don't know where it's going to go or, you know, what's going to happen in the future, but I just walk the path, I walk the journey and pray to Creator that He will guide as He sees fit.
Thank you. Oh, well, thank you, Ann, and thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, First Baptist Edmonton, for telling us a little bit of your story. We know that it's a journey, we know that it's hard, and we know that it's complex, but what I hear from you is that it's worth it, to acknowledge what happened in the past for the souls that are departed, that it's worth it for all those who are on the healing journey today, and that it's worth it, you know, for people to figure out the best ways to name themselves, to call themselves, to navigate this complex reality that is humanity, given the reality of our history. So more conversation for sure, and there'll be some time for question and answer for more. So please, Jeremy and Ann, stick around, but please know that we're really grateful for you all, and especially for you, Ann, for you providing us with your wisdom and your insight into your life and the story of your people and the story of healing and truth with that. And, you know, as we think about our neighbors in First Baptist Edmonton, my neighbors in First Baptist Edmonton, I also, you know, think about my own context, right? The context that I live in Washington, D.C., in the United States. And again, we have a very similar context, right? One of settler colonialism that's only just now becoming to be discussed. And of course, the context around enslavement, racial enslavement. And, you know, these things can be hard to talk about because we often just want our world to be better. But, you know, I'm of the belief that our world can't become better by pretending that everything is okay, but that we actually have to do the work. Like Jeremy said, we can't believe that the truth will set us free and then be afraid to explore the truth. And so part of the question, you know, for us, and part of why I'm really excited to get to talk to Geneva and to Caitlin from Ravensworth is because here we have, in a slightly different context, in the United States of America, in Northern Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C., kind of known as a progressive place as well, a liberal place. You know, we have the work that you all are doing at Ravensworth. So if Geneva and if Caitlin is still around, could join me here on the virtual stage, I want to hear a little bit about y'all's work, right? And about what Ravensworth is doing and examining its own history as a congregation, and how you all got started doing that work that you're doing.
Well, I got an email from Caitlin that she's been dropped by Zoom and can't get back on. So it's possible that our pastor is attending.
Oh, Caitlin's back.
Oh, she's back. Oh,
Caitlin's
great.
back. And if Leah wants to join me up here, Leah can join me too. You know, there's always room on the virtual stage.
I'm back. Thanks, Geneva. So sorry for the technical difficulties, but hopefully you all can hear me okay.
Yes, great. So feel free to jump in, Caitlin. Well, the United States is nowhere near having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to deal with the truth of slavery and racism that still flourishes in our country. So most of that work is done individually and in groups. After George Floyd's murder in 2020, our church, some of us read and studied how to be an anti-racist. And lots of other congregations in the area were doing the same thing. I learned about a series that a Jewish synagogue in the local area was doing called Unheard Histories, the racism in our communities. And the communities they were studying were all Washington suburbs, Arlington, Fairfax County, and Falls Church. And in the second one, focusing on Falls Church, one of the panelists said, names reflect what we value. So I began to think about the name of Ravensworth. Now, I vaguely knew that in addition to being the road adjacent to our church and a shopping center nearby and a subdivision, Ravensworth was also the name of a plantation. Now, the manor house burned in, I think it was 1926, and a historical marker was not erected on the site until 1992. So it's possible when the church was founded in 1959 that most of the congregants had little or no knowledge of that fact. But once I began to think about it and delve into the history of it, then I realized that where there is a plantation, there will be enslaved people. So I began to do some research, and there's a wealth of information, but you have to dig for it. And I was learning quite a bit. And Caitlin asked me to put a program together for our church on the history of the land. So a Fairfax County historian agreed to do a Zoom presentation for us. And she started with the hunter-gatherer indigenous people who once camped on our land. There's evidence of that through names, artifacts that have been found. And then she told us about the purchase of 23,000 acres by an immigrant from England. And that Ravensworth tract was part of that purchase. Overseers and enslaved people worked the land. The manor house was not built until about a century later. This happened about in the late 1600s. She brought us up to the 1960s when urbanization began to take over our once rural county. In the third of those seminars, which focused on Fairfax County, I learned that there were once 35 thriving African-American communities in Fairfax County. Now there are very few, and those are no longer predominantly African-American. Most of them have disappeared, but not by accident. The county had a deliberate policy of raising the communities. They would look at a community which didn't have running water and paved roads, and instead of providing them as they would have for the white residents, they declared them unsanitary and they got rid of them. A lot of them. Some of them were taken by eminent domain. One particular community near Ravensworth was taken for ostensibly for a school for white children. And the whole thriving community was destroyed. Now there's a park and a cemetery on that site. The cemetery is all that remains of that community at this point. So the purpose of this study and presentation was first to learn the truth, to think about how to acknowledge the truth, what it teaches us about systemic racism that continues to this day, and what we might do to, as Robert P. Jones would say, repent and repair.
I think I like where you ended, Geneva, on to repent and to repair. I mean, we know, right, that part of this work, right, is happening within the context of Thrive, right, which has been your congregation's commitment to becoming an anti-racist organization, which aligns with the Alliance's commitment to becoming an anti-racist organization. Caitlin, you chair that committee for your church. Talk to us about how you see this work excavating the roots of Ravensworth's history and the land around Ravensworth, the story of it becoming a plantation, or the story of it coming from a plantation rather, or being surrounded by a plantation. How do you see that, helping your congregation, helping Ravensworth to be an anti-racist church, an anti-racist congregation, an anti-racist community?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Geneva, for providing that excellent overview of the history of our land. We are blessed to have Geneva at our church, who is a history buff and has spearheaded so much of that work with excavating our roots. But truthfully, Elijah, we took we sort of took the cue from the Alliance of Baptists in terms of excavating our roots. I know that was a theme that you all started, and we borrowed that language and recognized how important it was for us as a church to really understand, the very local history of the space that our church occupies. It can impact the way that, certainly the way that our community looks now, as well as how we see things as a church, right? That history is so important in shaping the way that we see the world, and also, how the community sees us. Geneva mentioned that Ravensworth is named after that plantation. What does that mean for us as a church today? So, in addition to, sort of digging into the history, we've been having some really great conversations about what that means for our church and what that means for our work moving forward with Thrive. Our hope with Thrive is that this really becomes part of our church's DNA, right? This commitment to anti-racism is something that is integrated into everything that we do as a church. And so, understanding the past is pretty integral to that. So certainly grateful for all the work that Geneva has done to uncover it, because as she said, it's not written in our history books. It's not easy to find sort of a lot of what's been erased in terms of those thriving African-American communities right here in Fairfax. And, I mentioned this to you earlier, Elijah, I think, like to think of ourselves in Northern Virginia as a really progressive place, right? We think this, sure, slavery happened in Virginia, but in Northern Virginia, we're really progressive. We are, we're not racist, but when we think about just how much damage was done to those African-American communities right in our own county, it forces us to take a hard look.
Yeah, no, it's really important. And I think the work that you all do to acknowledge this truth, to me, is spiritual work, it's courageous work, and it's inspirational. A part of what I want to get from you all, right? Again, kind of like how I asked, our folks from First Baptist in Edmonton, to someone who maybe is afraid of what it might mean to learn, Gerardo put in the chat, I wonder how many other churches are named after plantations. I'm very curious about that as well. For someone who wants to begin this work, or a community of people that want to begin this work and maybe are afraid about what they might learn, are afraid about, what this history might say to them about their past, about, the institutions they've inherited leadership in, or, perhaps the families they come from. what do you say to them about how to navigate that, about how to still do that work, maybe despite that fear? It's for either of you, Geneva or Caitlin.
Well, I think that one of the things that we did was a lot of reading and learning some of the history ourselves. It can be generic kind of reading, like my adult Sunday school class read White Too Long about racism in churches in this country, and how so many Christian churches supported racism. So you can start broadly and then narrow it down to your own congregation. Let's see what happened in other places. Let's see if anything like that happened in our church. What does our written history say, if there is one? We have a written history of our church, which we are reviewing now through an anti-racist lens, to see what needs to be adjusted, should I say, or added to, because nothing about our the location of our church is included in that document. So I'd say begin broadly and then narrow it down.
Caitlin, what about you?
Yeah, well, I think that's excellent advice, Geneva. Thank you. And Elijah, one of your questions was, what about the fear of what you'll find? And I think I would say that the history is there, whether we uncover it or not, and it's influencing our day to day, whether we bring it to the light or not. And so, we're much more able to address it if we know and understand the history and do better going forward, rather than if we ignore it. Sort of the truth and reconciliation, right? Like, you can't have reconciliation without the truth.
No, that's really powerful. I like what both of y'all said, both from a strategic perspective of how to engage with it, and from the fact that it's there, right? That these things happen. They happened in Fairfax. They happen in Washington, D.C. They happen in Georgia and South Carolina, in Louisiana and Edmonton and California. They happen all over the places that we now reside. I'm mindful of the fact that Ravensworth is in Fairfax County in Virginia. And, the Fairfax County School District, as I understand, kind of started a lot of the discussions and the efforts to, ban what I consider to be an anti-racist approach to history. One of the things that I've always thought about is the idea that as public money is taken away from teaching the truth, from teaching history, that churches could play a role in stepping up, right, to try to struggle for that on moral terms, on theological terms, on justice terms. And I guess what I'm wondering is, for you all, what does it mean to be doing this work, excavating the roots of Ravensworth, within, the larger context of, what happened in your school district and what's happening, kind of all over the country in regards to teaching history?
Well, I heard someone say on one of these forums, a pastor from Texas said, if we want our children to know the truth, we have to teach it to them in church. Now, that may be more necessary in some states than in others, although I can't say that Virginia is exactly progressive in the area of race relations and in teaching them. And what we do is with a very broad brush and not very specific. So I think that we need to look at the specifics of our own situation and teach those and see what we can learn from about the broader context from that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And Elijah, I was so struck by what you said, that, if schools aren't teaching it, it is on us as churches to be teaching it as well. It's so important. It's part of It's our faith guides us to really find that truth and to seek justice. And so I also think one of the things that Geneva has done such a great job of is leveraging our partnerships with other local faith institutions that have been doing this work. And so, we didn't recreate the wheel. There were already quite a few churches and synagogues and mosques as well, and that we have partnerships with through some international also doing this work. And so I think sort of joining hands across churches and across different faith traditions to be able to uncover this and then teach it helps go even farther.
Yeah. No, I think a part of what I hear you all saying is that, there's room to kind of reconfigure how we do ministry, right? If we want to do partnership ministry with other congregations, other in our community, that this is a way to do it, to say, let's go together, let's see together where we live and what it means for us to live here. I'm sure that there is a story there. Thank you so much, Geneva and Caitlin, for sharing just a bit about the work that Ravensworth is doing. I know that you all are also on a journey, and that this work isn't perfect, but it sounds like it's worth it. Before opening it up to the audience, are there last words that you all would want to offer and share, just based off of the work that you all are doing, that you hope to leave with our folks gathered here?
Well, one thing that we've done is visit some of those, the sites that no longer, the communities that no longer exist. I put together a pamphlet that goes into the history, has some pictures, has directions from our church, and some of us went on, visited some of those. All of them were within no more than a 5-mile radius of the church. And there are many other sites that we could visit. It's just a way of standing on the land, learning about that history that has an impact that's different than any other way of understanding it.
Yeah. Caitlin, what about you?
Well, my only final thing is to say thank you to the Alliance, because, we have at our church long been having conversations about anti-racism, but the Thrive work really gave us some structure through which to do it, and really, that extra push that we needed. And so, though we've long been having these conversations, it is now working its way into our DNA, as it should. We are looking at our history, but also at all different aspects of the way that our church operates, our partnerships, our commitments. And Elijah, you said it right, which is that we are on a journey, and we are certainly on that journey, but we're grateful for the Alliance and your support along the way there.
Amen. Thank y'all. Well, let's go ahead and get all of us pinned here. We have about 20 or so minutes left for some question and answer. So feel free to throw some questions in the chat and direct it towards one of the folks who spoke, and I'll read a couple of them as we have time to discuss. I think that the work that both of these congregations are doing, are so important. For me as a minister and as a historian, I think that it's courageous and it's a part of our moral mandate, right? I think you all have said it, that, for us to be in the tradition that we're in, which is a truth-telling tradition, right? The biblical prophets, would say, thus says the Lord, and they would confront the leaders of the powers of the principalities. That's the tradition of Micah. That's the tradition of Jeremiah. That's the tradition of Tamar, even telling the truth about what happened to them, what happened to her. And so for us to stand in that truth and that tradition, I think we are compelled to. And so I'm grateful that you all are showing us a model and a way forward for how to do that. We have a question in the chat from Gerardo who asks, what advice do y'all have for lay leaders in particular who want to do this kind of work? I think a part of what's so interesting about this panel is that, it's mostly lay leaders. I mean, we got Jeremy and the good work that Jeremy's doing, but Geneva, Caitlin, and y'all are lay leaders. So what advice do y'all have for lay leaders who want to do this work? And what if, they don't have Leah as a pastor, right? They don't have Jeremy as one of the key staff members. How do you maybe get them to be enthusiastic and open to this work?
Well, I can start. So something that really propelled us forward at Ravensworth, certainly the partnership with the Alliance and Thrive, but it started by small groups having discussions around books, right? So Geneva mentioned How to Be an Anti-Racist. We've read Cast. There's been a whole bunch of book studies, My Grandmother's Hands, that we've done together. And I think, learning more about the impact of racism on individuals and communities, learning about what that looks like and really doing that individual education has so motivated folks at our church. And so the work that we've done has been very congregationally led, very organic. People got so excited about the different ideas and ways that we could move toward being an anti-racist church from reading these books. So that's worked really well for us.
Yeah.
Well, I remember reading a part of a document that the Thrive committee had developed. And one of the questions was, what is your passion? How can the church help you with this? Well, I wasn't thinking of my interest in the history as in those terms exactly, but that exactly is what happened. One person's passion became interesting to the rest of the congregation. So I assume that could work anyplace else. It doesn't have to be in a church that's on an active journey to learn about their history, for example.
Yeah. Ann and Jeremy, or what about y'all?
Well, I'll start by saying Anne is a layperson in our midst, and that's the fact that she brings her gifts. We don't put her on the payroll to do this work. This is just a part of her life in the community. And the other example I can think of is one of the women in the church came up to me a couple of years ago and said, there's a local elder who will lead us on a walk through the river valley that will show us the history of the land and tell us the story of the people. And she said, hey, would you be interested in that? And we said, sure. And since that time, the walks we've done with those Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers has been just valuable and fruitful and moving and just an incredible treat for us. And if she had just assumed, oh yeah, everybody knows about that, it's not a big deal, I'm sure they'll figure that out if they want to, we would never have heard about it, or it would have been a really long time. So I think sometimes it's just maybe showing up and speaking up and sharing the connections that you have, the lessons you've already learned. And you might be surprised that you have some really fruitful points of contact in your community that can help with this work.
Yeah. And I noticed that Paula has put in the chat, not really a question, but a point of connection, right? As a descendant of slaveholders, you have in your possession 2 wills that gave direction for what to do with the people they enslaved. And you have these traceable records, right, which help us to have a better understanding of that story, which helps us to really see in real terms, how this happened. I think the more documents, the more records that we can see, can just help us understand that this was a fact. It was a reality, and it's not the only reality that we have an option of recreating, but that there can be a different vision of what the world can be. That there's an opportunity, to use what we've learned in the past to try to chart a different future, which is what I think I see both of your congregations doing. Sarah has posed this question. Have you had any resistance? How did you handle it?
If we've had any at Ravensworth, it's been well hidden. I haven't encountered any.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Geneva. We've been really blessed that folks at Ravensworth have been on board from the beginning. And, when we started our work with Thrive, that was something that I asked our pastor, Leah, hey, because I was relatively new to being a member of the church when we started with Thrive. And so it's like, hey, where do you think the landmines are, right? Like what might be touchy for folks? And she said, honestly, I don't know that there are any. And I've found that to be true as well. So we are incredibly fortunate from that respect. But I will say something that's been really helpful for us in this work is making sure that it continues to be collaborative and congregationally led, and that we keep people updated regularly. So making sure that, there are lots of chances for people to voice their opinions about this work and remain updated has been a real, a good strategy for that.
Well, we've dealt with hard issues before and studied and thought about them and discussed them in a calm and reasoned manner. And that's how we came to be a welcoming and affirming church many years ago, before I even became a member. We were among the first Southern Baptist churches. We're no longer a Southern Baptist church, but when we were, had women deacons and women in the associate pastors. So it's not like this is something entirely new, is confronting something that's controversial head on and talking through it.
I would add, don't sleep on the young people. Invite them and just tell them, here's what we're doing now. And we've gone on this last summer, me and some young kids went on a pilgrimage to an ancient site on a hillside in central Alberta, big stones that have been there for thousands of years. Some of the best tobacco that our community grew was grown by teenagers. And we grow tobacco for part of our healing circles. And so our own community grows tobacco, and I have teenagers who grow that stuff. So it's a really great story. Yeah, I'm growing this tobacco for my church. Most teenagers probably can't say that. When we have shared meals together, I get the young people to come and help prepare the meals. And if you don't have every generation involved, especially the young folks, this work isn't going to last very long. So there's my plug for getting the young kids involved whenever you can.
Anne, do you have anything to add?
Well, I was just thinking when Jeremy started talking about young people, for quite some time now, I have been working with young people, but Indigenous young people in the schools around Edmonton and teaching some of their culture. A lot of them don't know their culture. They're just on the edge of learning, or they're still ashamed of being Indigenous. They going through a healing process, as well as being teenagers who struggle with so much other stuff. And we have had circles where we smudge and we sit and we listen and we share. And I've had some very powerful circles where the teenagers have actually shared their feelings and actually had tears in the circle because they finally let it out. They finally shared what they were feeling. And some of them struggle with some very deep issues, not just not just racism, but things like gender issues and other types of things that teenagers go through. So it's been a real blessing to be able to sit in the circle and just listen. And basically, that's what I do. I don't give out a lot of advice or anything. I listen and we pray together. We smudge together and be kind. We're kind to each other. I teach about being kind to each other. So one of our schools, as a matter of fact, changed its name from the name it had to a name. It's called Kisiwatan now, and that means kindness. So that was incredible. And I went to that school and did a smudging ceremony, and there was a whole program that went on to celebrate this new name for this school. And it was all junior high kids, teenagers. So these kind of things that, you know, they're not huge things. They're just simple everyday things that really, really matter.
No, thank you. Thank you, Anne, for sharing that. And thank you to all of you, to Anne, to Jeremy, to Caitlin, to Geneva, for the work that you all are doing and for you sharing your stories with us, the stories of how your churches are confronting your past, of how you're digging into the literal dirt, the ground, the land, that you're knowing your history. And, you know, for me, I think what has stood out to me in this conversation with you all has been the healing potential of this work. You know, as a historian who focuses particularly on the impact of the transatlantic slave trade on the making of the modern world, you know, I cover these grand topics that often, you know, people will say, it's too much, it's overwhelming. You know, the history is too sad, it's despairing. But then I think what we've come to find out, right, is that embedded in these numbers, embedded in these stories, you know, are real people, the people of our ancestors, whether they be Indigenous or First Nations or African or European or from wherever. And that part of our theological task, as I understand it, is to figure out how to be beloved community, is to figure out how to be in relationship. And what I hear you all saying to us very loudly and clearly, right, that we cannot be in deeper human relationships if we do not confront the truth, if we are unwilling to go down this path to find out what is our name. Like, what's the name of our church? What's the name of our neighborhood? Who are these people, and how does naming something after this person reflect our values? And what are our other values? What are our newer values? As we wrap up, you know, I want to put two things for deeper thought on the table. One thing that I've been reflecting on a lot, and I talk about a lot, is at the end of the book of Genesis, we have the story of Joseph. And in the story with Joseph, his brothers had sold him into slavery, and it told their father that he was dead, and a bunch of things happened where they are, and a bunch of things happened to Joseph. He's enslaved for a while, in prison for a while. Eventually, he makes his way up to the top of Egyptian society, and his brothers find themselves in need of his help. And so they realize that he's the prime minister of Egypt, and they go to him with fear and trembling, and they have a conversation. And in that conversation, you know, Joseph says to his brothers, what you intended for evil, God can use for good. And when I think about our history, whether it's the history of settler European relations with Indigenous and First Nations people, or whether it's the history of European descendant American whites and African Americans, Indigenous Americans in the United States, whether it's the history of US citizens to the rest of our neighbors in the Americas or in the global South, you I like to reinterpret that phrase, right? And to say what started off as evil, perhaps God can make good. And perhaps the hope, right, in doing this healing work together, perhaps the hope in looking at our histories together and examining the past and telling the truth about our past is that we can be honest that what started off as evil, as wicked, is not good, can turn into a different type of future, can turn into a different type of reality, can turn into a place where xenophobia really is Philadelphia. And I think that is the work that you all have invited us in, and I'm really grateful for that. A second part is a dream. And the dream, and Geneva, you've said this a couple times, that the United States is very far from doing truth and reconciliation work. I wonder what it would look like for the Alliance to be a part of a movement that pushes the United States to do some truth and reconciliation work. Perhaps we need it. And perhaps that's a part of the vision, the dream, the different reality. We're so grateful that you all chose to be with us this evening, to spend your evening with us, learning about these congregations and the work that they're doing, and hopefully beginning to reflect on how you'll do it in your own life, in your own community, in your own families and congregations. And I pray that you'll continue to journey with the Alliance in some very real ways. So next week, the Alliance will be meeting in person for the first time in a long time in Montgomery, Alabama, as we do some of this work too, where we'll journey to the Peace and Justice Memorial, where we will grapple with the history of racial violence in the United States. And we will pick up this conversation with our Thrive partners on December 6th at 7 p.m. Where we'll learn from other people and be able to have more dialogue in smaller groups about how we can excavate the roots of our churches, the roots of our communities, the roots of our families, if we would like. So please feel free to join us for that event and to continue to tune in to the work that the Alliance is doing. We thank you all for your participation. And we pray God's many blessings on you as you go forth and do this work. Thank you for being with us.